Hi, and welcome back to my series on Merleau-Ponty's The Structure of Behavior. I'm Shay Stevens. Today is part 5 in my series, and we are going to be talking about part 3 of the book. So here we are in bold. Last time we started part 3. Today we're going to finish part 3. Last time we talked about the introduction to part 3 and the section called the section on physical order. This time we're going to be talking about the sections on the vital order and the human order. As always, just wanted to put the main thesis of the book here for you, for us all to remember. Our goal is to understand the relations of consciousness and nature. So here's the breakdown of part 3, like I said. So last time we talked about the introduction and the segment titled Structure in Physics, about the physical order. So it's examining these 3 orders, these 3 kind of levels of structure, or 3 structures, if you will. And so then today we're talking about the vital structures, which is the vital order, and then the human order. And so the vital structures is going to be a lot of what Kurt Goldstein talked about, as through this whole book we see a lot of ideas from Kurt Goldstein. So we'll start off talking about vital structures, and so that's going to be kind of the topic of like, what is an organism? What is the object of biological knowledge? And then we'll talk about what Merleau-Ponty thinks makes humans humans. Okay, so just wanted to note that I am struck once again by how many of Goldstein's ideas we find in this book, and especially we see that in this section, which of this whole book is the most dedicated to the idea of an organism, of organic life. That's what vital structures means. All right, and so I'll say this in a later slide. We have a lot to get through today. There's just so much important stuff in this chapter, this part of the book. But I would just say to note that so much of the section comes from Kurt Goldstein, and you can see in the endnotes of the book the references to him. But I was going to say that in a later slide today, as we talk more about the human order, we do finally start to really see Merleau-Ponty taking off and emerging into his own ideas, or ideas that have been influenced by other important thinkers. He mentions Hegel more in this chapter of the book. So we will see a departure from what thus far through the vital structures section of the book is so much from Goldstein. Then when we start to talk about the human order, we do start to see Merleau-Ponty kind of taking off from there and either bringing in other thinkers or just starting to integrate more of his own thoughts on these topics. So the last section was on physical structures. He says, the physical form is an equilibrium obtained with respect to certain given external conditions. We speak of vital structures, on the contrary, when equilibrium is obtained not with respect to real and present conditions, but with respect to conditions which are only virtual, and which the system itself brings into existence, when the structure executes a work beyond its proper limits and constitutes a proper milieu for itself. So there's more of an autonomy, you might say, more of a structure within the organism for it to self-regulate. It brings into existence within itself. It's not purely determined by external conditions. An organism never realizes all the types of behavior which would appear possible if it were considered as a machine. So I thought this was a great and interesting quote that reminded me of when, in a previous part of this book, Merleau-Ponty had been bringing up the idea of a machine, and I had said at the time in my commentary that it's an interesting concept of kind of like living organisms, of a human versus a machine. And here he clearly says that he does not think that humans can do more than the machine. On the contrary, an organism cannot realize all of its possible types of behavior as if it were considered as a machine. So we are more limited as organisms than a machine is in that way, in that respect. So I think that's a very interesting little quote. Anyway, that's kind of an aside. For the most part, preferred behavior is the simplest and most economical with respect to the task in which the organism finds itself engaged. So here, reminding me of Kurt Goldstein, he said that, kind of in critique of the Gestalt psychologists who might have sometimes leaned in so far to physical structures and the idea of equilibrium, it's not simply a question of what is the simplest way to achieve equilibrium. Preferred behavior, which is a concept from Kurt Goldstein's book, The Organism, it is with respect to the task in which the organism finds itself. So it's in a given situation, and it's in regard to a certain task that the organism will try to do that in the simplest way. He says, the reactions evoked by a stimulus depend upon the significance which it has for the organism considered, not as a group of forces which tend toward rest by the shortest paths, but as a being capable of certain types of action. In the act of pointing out the preferred plan where the arm moves, far from being determined by the conditions of a physical equilibrium with the milieu, corresponds to the internal necessities of a vital equilibrium, so of the organism. It depends not on local conditions, but on the total activity of the organism. So it's very much Kurt Goldstein's idea. One is led to the idea that there exists a general structure of behavior for each individual, which is expressed by certain constants of conduct, of sensible and motor thresholds, of affectivity, of temperature, of blood pressure, in such a way that it is impossible to find causes and effects in this ensemble, each particular phenomenon expressing equally well what one could call the essence of the individual. Okay, I'll just read the next quote here. Each organism in the presence of a given milieu has its optimal conditions of activity and its proper manner of realizing equilibrium. So it has consistent traits, properties, things about it that determine how it realizes equilibrium. He continues, and the internal determinants of this equilibrium are not given by a plurality of vectors, but by a general attitude toward the world. So that's kind of this criticism, calling out those who wanted to pay so much attention to kind of like field forces and all of the factors of the environment. That might be valid to an extent, but what you also have to really focus on, Goldstein said, was kind of the traits, the essence of the individual organism that determines what is an appropriate, what is appropriate in its milieu for it to self-actualize, for it to meet its needs in that task. Again, I mentioned this in my series on Kurt Goldstein's book, The Organism, but he was very focused on the task at hand. When he used the word self-actualization, it's about an organism meeting its needs according to what it as an individual or what it as a member of a particular species, what those needs are, kind of tells you the essence of the thing. It's all very present moment oriented to a present task. It's not essentialism. The organism itself measures the action of things upon it, and itself delimits its milieu by a circular process, which is without analogy in the physical world, so physical structures. The relations of the organic individual and its milieu are truly dialectical relations. So there are references to Hegel in this part of the book for those who are interested. There's another reference on page 153. There are more that we'll see in later slides. There's so much in these parts of these sections of the book. I'm not even going to cover all of the references to other thinkers that I wish I could cover. I do just want to shout them out for others to go and read it for themselves, those who know more about all of these thinkers. But definitely the key concept of dialectical relations is big in this part of the book and in the part on the human order. So there's something about this that is a circular process between the organic individual, the organism, and its milieu. So just wanted to mention, he raises the critique of the Gestalt theorists that he has mentioned before, and then says it is Gestalt theory's own principles which we are invoking against it here. In a form, the whole is not the sum of its parts. The whole is not reducible to a simple sum of its parts. And again, we're racing kind of through this section today. We're not going to talk at length about much of this. I do just want to give you the quotes for you to go and look for yourself at the parts that really speak to you. But I had mentioned in the last video kind of this question of like how much is he informed by Gestalt theory's principle, and he uses that principle in his criticism of Gestalt. So there's kind of this question of like, to what extent is he criticizing it, or to what extent is he actually like fulfilling the principles of Gestalt? I think Merleau-Ponty really stands as an important link in the chain of the development of Gestalt ideas. He is a continuation and a fulfillment of the Gestalt principle of a whole that is not reducible to the sum of its parts. It's not that he is standing in defiance against the core principle of Gestalt, although he critiques how others had gotten lost in how they conceptualized Gestalt at times, particularly the physical Gestalts, which we talked about that last time, so I won't go into that anymore. And then he has this really cool quote, I thought, where he says, "To construct a physical model of the organism would be to construct an organism." So that's kind of a continuation of his commentary on a critique of the idea of a physical Gestalt. So he says he is not opting for vitalism. He says, "We are upholding no species of vitalism whatsoever here. We do not mean that the analysis of the living body encounters a limit in irreducible vital forces. We mean only that the reactions of an organism are understandable and predictable only if we conceive of them not as muscular contractions which unfold in the body, but as acts which are addressed to a certain milieu, present or virtual. The act of taking a bait, of walking toward a goal, of running away from danger. The object of biology is evidently not to study all the relations which can be obtained from a living body in any conditions whatsoever, but only those which are its reactions, or, as one says, adequate reactions. Everything which can occur to an organism in the laboratory is not a biological reality." So just to summarize, he's saying that when we talk about what is kind of proper to a species or to an organism, he's not opting for vitalism or essentialism. He's just saying that physics and biology are different, in that in physics we can kind of just talk about all the different ways of looking at things in the universe and how laws can describe them. We can kind of isolate things, we can look at it from all these different perspectives. A lot more depends on just how we are perceiving it. In biology, we are more limited to asking what is proper to an organism, how does it act in its life, what are its norms. So in kind of treating a thing as something that has norms or an essence, it doesn't mean it's essentialism, it just means we are limiting ourselves to understanding to study the relations which can be obtained, which have to do with its adequacy to its needs, to learning about a thing according to how it works. It's immanent, meaning it's immanent self-regulation. So that's really what he's saying here, is biology is different from physics in that way. He says the individual as a specific capacity of reaction is an ultimate category or irreducible model of biological knowledge. Organic structure is not just one of these de facto structures which physics encounters. It is a structure in principle. So again, it's not just this question of given certain external conditions, what does it do, but rather what is proper to this thing. We have to, in biology, be more limited to what can we learn about an organism as an organism? What can we learn about a species as a species? So there's principle, structure and principle. He says, the idea of signification permits conserving the category of life without the hypothesis of a vital force, vitalism. The resistance of the concrete given to the approximate laws of physics is anonymous, as it were. It is the opaqueness of the fact, the shock of the unexpected result on the experience of an inexpressible quality. And so I don't think it was supposed to say of the experience of an inexpressible quality. But anyway, what he's saying here is we are confronted with the fact that in biology, when we study life, we are confronted with the fact that it does not always go according to kind of a mechanistic way, 2 + 2 = 4 kind of way. There is something about life, organic life, that sometimes acts in a way that we cannot predict. It's more complex. We are confronted with kind of its being, that it has an internal immanent signification, immanent meaning. It's not just determined by laws in the same way that physics works. Okay, he says, the organism is distinguished from the systems of classical physics because it does not admit of division in space and in time. Nerve functioning is not punctually localizable. A kinetic melody is completely present as its beginning, and the movements in which it is progressively realized can be foreseen only in terms of the whole. So Kurt Goldstein's whole thing was, when we look at organisms, we have to take them in as a whole, the organism as a whole. It cannot be divided in the same way that a physical system can be divided. In physics, it depends more of just our perception to determine the form in a way that is different than the role of perception in the study of life, of biology. In biology, the particularities of an individual organism are more and more closely connected with its capacity for action. The structure of the body in man is the expression of character. The unity of physical systems is a unity of correlation, that of organisms a unity of signification. Next, he says, the significance and value of vital processes, which science, as we have seen, is obliged to take into account, are assuredly attributes of the perceived organism, but they are not extrinsic denominations with respect to the true organism. For the true organism, the one which science considers, is the concrete totality of the perceived organism, that which supports all the correlations which analysis discovers in it, but which is not decomposable into them. So it is not merely determined by perception. Physical structures are more so determined by how they are perceived. At some point, I forget which page it was, Merleau-Ponty says that as we go through these 3 orders, they become more deeply integrated and more individual. So the kind of integration of a human it's even more of an individual, he says, like in itself. even less determined by its conditions than the orders which came before it. He says, both in psychology and biology, the apprehension of structures should be recognized as a kind of knowing which is irreducible to the comprehension of laws. So in the section on physical structures, he talks kind of about laws and how physics is dedicated to kind of just the question of laws. Versus in biology, we're not just talking about laws, we're really we're guided more by a species, by a thing. It's more about what are its self-organizing principles. How does it work in itself? It's not completely determined by its own self. It's not completely autonomous, but it has some different degree of autonomy and self-regulation than in a different area of science, which studies physical laws. Okay, so he says, he just kind of mentions that for him, he's going to use the phrase phenomenal body to mean a living body. He says the perception of the living body, or as we shall say from now on, of a phenomenal body. So just wanted to note that. So here on this, in this part, he's going to bring up the concept of a phenomenon. So he's rejecting vitalism. He says these remarks cannot serve to justify a vitalism. However, even the refined vitalism of Bergson, the relation of the vital, I don't know how to say this word, elan, to that which it produces is not conceivable, it is magical. So he says vitalism is not scientific enough, it is not precise enough, it just is kind of this magical line of thinking, which is basically what Goldstein said as well. He says both mechanists and vitalists consider the organism as a real product of an external nature, when in fact it is a unity of signification, a phenomenon in the Kantian sense. So that's an important quote. He says, the totality is not an appearance, it is a phenomenon. It's not merely appearance of wholeness. It has this immanent signification. Phenomenon is, I guess I don't really want to try to define that right now, but for me there's so many words that relate to the idea of a gestalt, of a whole, of something that has kind of innate meaning, yet something that is at the same time necessarily perceived. In all of this, he never gets to be a fan of a thing in itself. That's never what he wants to arrive at. It's still something that is perceived. It's not merely an appearance. So phenomenon seems to be another one of these concepts that describes that idea. I am definitely not an expert on Kant, and I know that Kant is pervasive in this book. The critical school, critical idealism, like these are kind of words that are tossed around that I'm not really sure where Kant fits in, how much was him versus like neo-Kantians. That's not my area of expertise. So I'll leave it at that for others to hopefully say more on what that idea of a Kantian phenomenon means. Okay, next quote, he says, every organism is a melody which sings itself. It's a beautiful quote. This is not to say that it knows this melody and attempts to realize it. It is only to say that it is a whole which is significant for a consciousness which knows it, not a thing which rests in itself. Our external experience is that of a multiplicity of structures, of significant wholes. And to paraphrase, he says, some physical wholes find adequate expression in mathematical laws. Others, living beings, present the particularity of having behavior. So this is a great, very much short and sweet nutshell way of explaining what I was trying to say a few minutes ago. The difference between physics and biology. Biology studies living beings which have behavior. The structure of behavior, like the title of the book, which means that they have an internal norm. And these are concepts from Kurt Goldstein's book, The Organism. Norm means no more and no less than the simple observation of a preferred attitude, statistically more frequent, which gives a new kind of unity to behavior. So a norm, or an essence in Goldstein's terms, does not need to be this soul, this essence in a metaphysical way. He explicitly says he's not here to establish a metaphysics. It's just the word that he wants to use to describe patterns of behavior that we notice that are statistically more frequent. We seem to observe preferences in either an individual's preference or the preference that is consistent across a species. And it gives us a way of conceptualizing its behavior, seeing a unity in that behavior that's not simply imposed by my perception, but it's there. It's imminently part of the meaning of the living being. He says, the whole in the organism is an idea, as Spinoza thought. However, while Spinoza believed he was able to rediscover the unity of the body beyond the fragmented extension of the imagination, in a law homogeneous with the law of physical systems, it does not seem possible to understand life by a regressive analysis which goes back to its conditions. It will be a prospective analysis which will look for the immanent signification of life. The ideal structure of behavior allows us to link the present state of the organism with a prior state taken as given, to see in the former the progressive realization of an essence already legible in this latter, without our ever being able to go beyond the limit or make of the idea a cause of existence. So he is explicitly saying, I do not want to take, as I've said many times before in this series, he's exploring this polarity between idea and thing, consciousness and nature in itself, the nature of a thing seen in itself or seen as external from kind of external terms. He says, I do not want to make the idea so strong of a player that it is the cause of a thing's existence. He does not want to take idealism that far. But it is the ideal structure of behavior, he says, that allows us to link these states of the organism to see the progressive realization of an essence. Okay, so those are the concluding words of the section on vital structures. So I would just note that concept of phenomenon, I think, was important there. Again, I'm just kind of noting some important terms, important quotes, and I am not enough of an expert to explain in depth, really, everything that he's saying, but I hope to bring this text to you, to present it to you, for you to have a little bit of an idea of what he's talking about, and then for you to go and do that reading yourself. Hoping to just contribute to the dialogue and raise awareness of these really great and important questions in this book so that more people can read it and can continue this conversation, and so I can learn more about all of this too. Okay, so those are the concluding words of the section on vital structures. Now we're going to go into the human order. Okay, so I do want to say that we are kind of in this transition point where up until now, his ideas have so much been the same ideas that we saw in Goldstein's book, The Organism. Not 100%, but like a very, very strong presence in this book from Goldstein. So here we are going to start to see him develop other ideas. We definitely hear other important philosophers mentioned, and there's, I'm sure, also just this synthesis of Merleau-Ponty's own thinking, that he's starting to arrive at his own notions of things, his own balance among these questions of idea and thing. But we will see in the section on humans some important terms from Goldstein. So I just wanted to mention that he continues to share with Goldstein the rejection of vitalism and metaphysical speculation. And we are going to see in this section some terms, which right here I just wanted to note them. So remember this when you see these terms, the term essence, term attitude, preferred values or preferred behavior, and orientation toward the possible. These terms we'll see when he talks about humans. So a lot of this section is not from Goldstein, but he does sprinkle throughout this chapter descriptions of what makes humans human that he does seem to get from Goldstein. He says, in describing the physical or organic individual and its milieu, we have been led to accept the fact that their relations were not mechanical, but dialectical. So notice again that word dialectical. The milieu and the aptitude are like two poles of behavior and participate in the same structure. This is one of those quotes that I think is a very important quote. This section on humans, for me, is the hardest section I've read so far, in that it is so kind of lofty, philosophical. It can be challenging. And so this is one of those quotes that I wanted to put it on my slideshow and just notice it and keep it in mind that these two terms, milieu and aptitude, are going to be like two poles on the spectrum, two poles of behavior. And they are, I think, dialectical. They are kind of in this circular process, and they are participating in the same structure. We saw the word aptitude in the last chapter in part 2 of this book, where he had already kind of started to talk about humans before. And so, I think that as we go through this part, ideas will be expressed a bit more in depth that relates to this. But right now I can't exactly describe exactly what he means. But this is going to be an important quote to keep in mind, in the words milieu and aptitude. In speaking here of knowledge and consequently of consciousness, we are not constructing a metaphysics of nature. We are limiting ourselves to denominating, so basically naming, the relations of the milieu and the organism, as science itself defines them as they should be denominated. So this is very much what Goldstein said at some point in his book. He's not out to construct a metaphysics. He is here to be descriptive. In recognizing that behavior has a meaning and depends upon the vital significance of situations, biological science is prohibited from conceiving it as a thing in itself, which would exist, parts, extra parts, in the nervous system or in the body. Rather, it sees in behavior an embodied dialectic which radiates over a milieu immanent to it. So it sees in behavior an embodied dialectic. That's an important phrase. He says, there is no question of returning to any form whatsoever of vitalism or animism, but simply of recognizing that the object of biology cannot be grasped without the unities of signification, which a consciousness finds and sees unfolding in it. So he just says, again, there is a key difference in the way that a field like physics operates and the field of biology operates. There's more of an idea of a meaning, of immanent meaning in a thing, which consciousness perceives. So he's really repeatedly rejecting the idea that he is building up a metaphysics or buying into vitalism. Okay, sorry for the duplicate slide, noting that on page 162 in my edition, there are more references to Hegel. Okay, so again, we hear about this example of a melody, melodic unity. He says there are melodic unities, significant wholes, experienced in an indivisible manner, as poles of action and nuclei of knowledge. Primitive knowledge. So notice that word primitive. It's going to come up. Primitive knowledge is not comparable to the result of an energetic process in which the tendencies and needs would be released over a mosaic of pure qualities and would give directions to an impartial, thinking subject which it will docilely execute. Perception is a moment of the living dialectic of a concrete subject. It participates in its total structure, and correlatively, it has as its original object not the unorganized mass, but the action of other human subjects. This is another really important quote that I'm just going to kind of put it out there, and I'm not really going to be able to explain this, unpack this all. I think as we continue to read on, we're going to hear more of like, what's this idea of primitive knowledge? To say just something about that, he's basically exploring consciousness. In humans, there is this consciousness that is deeper than in other organisms, right? But he says consciousness is not just about what we are kind of consciously thinking. There is something that is kind of more, for lack of a better word, like intuitive, something more immediate. And so it's not just idea. It's not that extreme on the pole of thing and idea. There is something concrete about perception, and it is living. It's we're gonna see this idea, but lived reality. I think that might come up soon. If I don't think we've gotten there yet. Perception, he says, is a moment of the living dialectic of a concrete subject. It participates in its total structure and has as its original object the action of other human subjects. So we will see more words on some of this. Okay, so he's going to talk about infantile perception. He says, let us try to start from descriptive characteristics and indicate how they compel us to conceive of the structure of consciousness. Infantile perception attaches itself, first of all, to faces and gestures, in particular to those of the mother. He says form is once again going to help us out, and it's going to be an important concept to talk about human consciousness. He says this same notion of form will permit us to describe the mode of existence of the primitive objects of perception. So notice that word primitive again. They are lived as realities, we have said, rather than known as true objects. So this is a really important quote. I think that there is so much here summed up in these few words. I think this whole book is really densely packed, and in earlier chapters we could get away more with kind of skipping over some of the formalities of what he's exploring. In this chapter, there's just so much that he just like drops these quotes, that there's so much there. But I think to kind of try to think about what he's saying there, he wants to kind of explore, okay, what is it that really human perception, what is human consciousness like? Not just in that, oh, we've reached these great achievements in writing, and he will talk about art and culture, but when we get down to more like kind of primitive forms of consciousness, of human experience, there are differences between us and animals that's not just about our great achievements in language and speech. The way that we relate to other humans is different than relations among animals or animals to humans. So he's looking at something that is more quote unquote primitive, more innate, more immediate. Those are probably not the best words, but more instant. So he says, primitive objects of perception. So form describes the mode of existence of the primitive objects of perception. These objects of perception are lived as realities. They are not known. So, of course, always keeping in mind this spectrum between thing, object, objectivity, realism, and consciousness, on the other hand, idea, knowledge. Knowledge is important. It's related to aptitude. But there's something about the human experience that is lived. It's not just known. So this kind of idea of, is consciousness intellectualism? He has said before that he does not want to opt for the extreme of intellectualism in order to account for consciousness, in order to account for human consciousness. It's not just about going that far of intellectualism. The difference between humans and animals can be seen in kind of this way of living perception, and not just on a conscious level knowledge of a clearly defined object. He's going to talk about like content and representation. Those things are not needed for this kind of primitive form of perception. I just think that's a really important quote that I might not be doing justice to it, but please note this quote and remember it. He says, speech and other persons. So in the human experience, these are two major parts of what humans do. They have speech and they relate to other people. Speech and other persons, therefore, cannot derive their meaning from a systematic interpretation of sensory phenomena in the multiple given. They are indecomposable structures, and in that sense are a prioris. At the same time that one abandons the notion of the multiple given, one will doubtless be obliged to abandon the notion of mental activity as the principle of all coordinations. Indeed, as soon as one refuses to separate the relation from the different concrete structures which appear in experience, it is no longer possible to found all relation on the activity of the epistemological subject. So I think he's saying here again, it's not a mechanistic kind of thing, and it's not a pure ideal. Idealism is not pure idea. The activity of the subject does not purely determine relation. Okay, so here we're going to be talking about kind of, he's going to start to mention the word representations, and so in all of this we're seeing him talk about what we perceive as humans that is kind of before we get to this clear formation of it in our mind. So the Gestalt is kind of this idea of like a figure that arises in perception that is clearly accentuated. We can see that form clearly standing out from the ground, right? But he's saying that we have consciousness of things before they are really clearly identified. He says, a person can be given to a child as the pole of his desires and fears. Sorry, that's supposed to say fears. His desires and fears before the long work of interpretation, which would arrive at the person as a conclusion from a universe of representations. So when we look at a child, they can relate to another person in relation to his desires or to his fears before that child has reached this kind of really conscious conclusion that, oh, I've thought about it and this is what you mean to me. It's more of an instant relation. And that still is consciousness. Consciousness does not mean this very calculated result. It does not only mean that. He says it may happen, for example, that in entering a room, we perceive a poorly localized disorder. So we have this sense that there is something that is disordered here. before discovering the reason for this impression. For example, it was an asymmetrical position of a picture frame. We can walk in and perceive that before we really isolate, before we identify what it is that is disordered. We can kind of be aware of that, be conscious of it before we more consciously, the stereotypical use of the word conscious, before we identify the reason. So he says, more is accessible to our consciousness than just representations or content. If, as we have just said, representative consciousness is only one of the forms of consciousness, and if this latter, consciousness, is defined more generally by reference to an object, whether it be willed, desired, loved, or represented, the felt movements will be linked together by a practical intention which animates them, which makes of them a directed melody. And it becomes impossible to distinguish the goal and the means as separable elements. So means to an end, means to a goal. Impossible to treat human action as another solution to the problems which instinct resolves. An analysis of the immanent meaning of action and its internal structure is substituted for an analysis of the goals of action and their means. So when we look at humans, we're not just talking about the same kind of instincts that an animal has. There is a different immanent meaning within actions. The internal structure is different. And so consciousness can be defined, Merleau-Ponty says, as a reference to an object, whether it be willed, desired, loved, or represented. So we can have this felt movement. Felt movements will be linked together by an intention. And so there's a wholeness, such as that seen in the melody, the way of illustrating the idea of a gestalt, a form, a whole that is not reducible to a sum of its parts. It's not mechanistic. It's not 2 + 2 = 4. It is a whole. There is a relationship, I think, is what he's talking about when it comes to human consciousness. Although all actions permit an adaptation to life, the word life does not have the same meaning in animality and humanity, and the conditions of life are defined by the proper essence of the species. The act, for example, of dressing. So he talks about kind of like we, like animals, want shelter. We have these similar kind of practices. But then he brings up the act of dressing. It becomes the act of adornment or also of modesty in humans, and thus reveals a new attitude toward oneself and others. So notice that word attitude. That's what Kurt Goldstein had used that term. Only men see that they are nude. In the house that he builds for himself, man projects and realizes his preferred values. Finally, the act of speaking expresses the fact that man ceases to adhere immediately to the milieu, that he elevates it to the status of spectacle and takes possession of it mentally by means of knowledge, properly so called. So just to explain a little bit, much like Goldstein said, with humans, they do not adhere as immediately to their milieu as animals do. They are not as tied to the immediate. We'll see here in just a minute, maybe in the next slide or two, this attitude toward the possible, or this orientation to the possible. That was a term that we saw Goldstein use that characterizes humans. We can transcend our immediate situation. We can think more generally. We have a way of thinking about the possible. We can think about like, oh, what if this happened? What if I was in this perspective over here? What if I wasn't right here where I am? He uses the term alter ego as this capability of humans to take on other perspectives, to think about things not so much in a way of like This is where I am. What do I need to do based on my immediate circumstances, based on my milieu? So as Goldstein said, Merleau-Ponty also thinks that humans have this ability to not only be shaped by their environment, but to take possession of their environment to shape the world around them. He says, but this lived consciousness does not exhaust the human dialectic. So lived consciousness is an important term there, I think. What defines man is not the capacity to create a second nature, economic, social, or cultural, beyond biological nature. It is rather the capacity of going beyond created structures in order to create others. So I think that was supposed to say it is rather the capacity of going beyond created structures in order to create others. This power of choosing and varying points of view permits man to create instruments, not under the pressure of a de facto situation, but for a virtual use, and especially in order to fabricate others. The meaning of human work, therefore, is the recognition beyond the present milieu of a world of things visible for each eye under a plurality of aspects, the taking possession of an indefinite time and space. So again, that's this kind of description of human work being addressed not just to the present circumstances, but to the possible. So that's what he says here. He says, these acts of the human dialectic all reveal the same essence, the capacity of orienting oneself in relation to the possible, to the mediate, and not in relation to a limited milieu. They all reveal what we called above with Goldstein, the categorial attitude. I don't think that's a typo. I think in the book it said categorial, not categorical. Correlatively, perception can become, especially by means of art, perception of a universe. The knowledge of a truth is substituted for the experience of an immediate reality. Okay, so there's just not enough time or knowledge on my part to adequately cover everything in this chapter. So the next few pages from 177 in my edition through 180, he critiques what he calls the Freudian system. He also sprinkles in there some really interesting questions. He mentions Nietzsche there towards the end on page 180. Very interesting stuff that I just don't have time to cover today. So now we're nearing the end of part 3 in the last few pages here. So he says, man is not like an animal just with some extra stuff added in or on top of it. Man is qualitatively different. So the quote here, he says, man is not a rational animal. The appearance of reason in mind does not leave intact a sphere of self-enclosed instincts in man. I'm not going to go too much into that, but just to say that he thinks that there is this human order that really is a different level of integration than the vital order. It's not a different substance. He's not an essentialist. He says that in this chapter. But he says that there is what I would say is this qualitative difference that we see across his patterns of behavior. It's not this retention of animalness plus reason. There's just a whole different structure in a lot of ways. Okay, so he's in the conclusion now. There's a lot. I wish I could just read and write out here the whole conclusion. It's less than a page long, and it really sums things up very succinctly. And he also really talks in a very interesting way about what's going to come next in the book. But I was not able to type out the whole thing, so I would encourage you to read it for yourself. But I did type out 2 paragraphs from it on this slide and the next, so I'll just read it. Aided by the notion of structure or form, we have arrived at the conclusion that both mechanism and finalism should be rejected. and that the physical, the vital, and the mental, so that's the physical order, the vital order, and the human order, do not represent three powers of being, but three dialectics. Physical nature in man is not subordinated to a vital principle. The organism does not conspire to actualize an idea, and the mental is not a motor principle in the body. But what we call nature is already consciousness of nature. What we call life is already consciousness of life. And what we call mental is still an object vis-a-vis consciousness. So this is summarizing his ideas that he's been developing. Okay, our last slide here, towards the end of the conclusion of part 3, before next time we get into part 4. He says, we could not simply superimpose these three orders. Not being a new substance, each of them had to be conceived as a retaking and a new structuration of the preceding one. So now he's going to talk about what he will need to move into in the next section of the book in order to finish up his ideas, in order to kind of complete what he has started to build up here. He says, from this comes the double aspect of the analysis, which both liberated the higher from the lower and founded the former on the latter. So founded the lower on the higher. Or founded the higher on the lower. It is this double relation which remains obscure, and which now induces us to situate our results with respect to the classical solutions, and in particular with respect to critical idealism. So I won't really go into what's going to come next. I'm going to wait until next time to get into that. But he says there's kind of this ambiguity. There's this double relation between the higher and the lower. And he wants to talk about how do the higher structure, these higher orders relate to the lowers. He's going to kind of talk about the idea of body and soul in part 4. Like, what does he mean by that? He says they are not two substances, they are relative. He's going to be using these terms relatively. I'll just say that just to give you a taste of what he's going to be going into in part 4. So he's going to be, he says, situating his results with respect to the classical solutions and with respect to critical idealism. So I'm going to try to do all of part 4 in our next video. We'll see if I succeed with that. So that might be our last video next time. Thanks for coming along.